My name is Sophia. I'm 28, and I've spent my entire life trying to meet my mother's impossible standards. But at my engagement party last Saturday, I finally realized why nothing I did would ever be enough. I still feel the champagne glass shaking in my hand as I watched my mother's face transform from her practiced social smile to something cold and calculating. The room was filled with everyone who mattered in our lives. James's family with their genuine warmth, my father's business associates, my childhood friends who had witnessed years of my mother's constructive criticism. This was supposed to be the night she would finally see me as enough. Instead, it became the night that exposed 30 years of buried family secrets in front of 78 shocked witnesses. What my mother did with that microphone destroyed something inside me that I had spent my entire adult life protecting. But what happened next, what my grandmother did from that corner table, changed everything we thought we knew about our family. And now I understand why my mother has always looked at me with such disappointment. It was never about me at all. Dramatic introduction. 3 days before the engagement party, I stood in my childhood bedroom staring at the dress I'd chosen. Not the one I wanted, the one my mother would approve of. Navy blue, conservatively cut, expensive enough to silently communicate our family's status without being ostentatious. Mother's fashion philosophy in physical form. The Crawfords will be there, Sophia. She had reminded me on the phone that morning. And the Merricks. This isn't just an engagement announcement. It's a statement about who we are. Who we are. As if our identity were something that needed defending. I remember James calling while I was still at my parents' house, his voice electric with excitement. "I just picked up the ring, Soph. It's perfect." I lowered my voice instinctively, though no one was home. Old habits. James didn't understand why I still whispered in my own family home. The day of the party arrived with that strange mixture of anticipation and dread I've felt at every significant event in my life, knowing my happiness was balanced against my mother's approval. The venue looked stunning. I'd made sure of that. White roses and silver accents throughout the garden terrace of the Westbrook Hotel. The weather cooperated with a sunset that painted everything in gold. I was adjusting a centerpiece when I heard her voice behind me. Sophia. Just my name, but delivered with that familiar undercurrent of evaluation. I turned to see my mother, impeccably dressed in her signature pearl gray, her critical gaze already sweeping over the arrangements, the decorations, the place settings. "Mother," I said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. She allowed it briefly. That's when I noticed her eyes fixed on my hand. On the ring. James had saved for months, chosen a vintage setting that reminded him of a story I'd told on our third date. It wasn't the flawless 3-carat diamond my mother had hinted at when we announced our engagement. It was something personal, something that mattered to us. The slight tightening around her mouth told me everything. "Interesting choice," she said, her eyes not leaving the ring, not meeting mine. Rather, understated. In that moment, I should have known what was coming. The signs were all there, just as they'd always been. But I was still hoping, after 28 years, that this time would be different. Building context. James and I met 2 years ago at a charity auction for the Children's Hospital where he works as a pediatric nurse. I was there representing my family's foundation, my assigned role as the daughter of Margaret and William Clark. I was supposed to network, make appropriate small talk, and ensure our family name appeared in the right column of the society page the next day. Instead, I found myself hiding in a service corridor, breathing into my hands after spending 40 minutes being scrutinized by my mother's friends. That's where James found me. "Panic attack or hiding from someone?" he asked, leaning against the wall beside me. No judgment in his voice, just gentle understanding. He was wearing blue scrubs under a hastily donned blazer, a hospital ID still clipped to his pocket. Option 3, contemplating an escape through the kitchen and never coming back, I replied. He laughed, and something in that laugh felt like permission to be myself. "I'm James. I work upstairs in the pediatric wing. I'm only here because my patient Ellie made me promise to bid on a specific painting she wants for the children's ward. I remember studying him then. This man with kind eyes who made promises to sick children and kept them, who wore wrinkled scrubs to a black tie event and seemed completely unembarrassed by it. I'm Sophia Clark, I said, waiting for the usual reaction when people connected me to my family. Nice to meet you, Sophia Clark. Want to help me bid on a terrible painting of dinosaurs playing basketball? It's for a good cause. He didn't know who I was, or he didn't care. Either way, it was the first breath of fresh air I'd taken in years. We spent the evening bidding on Ellie's painting, drinking champagne in a corner away from the crowds, and talking about everything except social status and family expectations. By the end of the night, I knew he'd grown up in a modest neighborhood across town, had worked through community college, and chose nursing because, in his words, I wanted to be the person who makes terrible days a little less terrible. My mother noticed us talking. Of course she did. Her text that night was brief. The Henderson boy was asking about you. Much more suitable. But it was too late. Something had shifted inside me. For the first time, I saw the possibility of a life measured by something other than my mother's approval. Our worlds couldn't have been more different. James came from a warm, chaotic family that gathered for Sunday dinners in a too-small house filled with laughter. They argued openly, resolved conflicts with hugs, and never, ever left things unsaid. His mother, Elena, embraced me the first time we met with the kind of unconditional warmth I'd spent my life craving. When I brought James to meet my parents 3 months later, my mother's smile never reached her eyes. She asked polite questions about his career aspirations, while making it clear that being a nurse was something one did on the way to becoming something else, something better. Sophia has always been drawn to charity cases, she said during dessert, patting my hand as if bestowing praise. James saw through it immediately. In the car afterward, he took my hand and said, "You don't have to apologize for her. It's not your job to translate her cruelty into something palatable." No one had ever said that to me before. No one had ever absolved me of responsibility for my mother's behavior. This relationship wasn't just about love. It was about freedom. James saw me, not the Clark daughter, not the society page footnote, not the perfect ornament my mother had tried to shape me into, just Sophia. And for that, I would have defied anyone, even Margaret Clark. The perfect moment shattered. The engagement party reached that perfect crescendo around 9 o'clock. The champagne was flowing, the string quartet played softly in the background, and even my father seemed to be enjoying himself. A rare sight at family gatherings. James's parents were charming everyone they met, their genuine warmth creating ripples of actual unscripted laughter throughout the terrace. "Should we do the toast now?" James whispered, his hand warm against the small of my back. I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Public speaking had always terrified me, but tonight was different. Tonight I wanted to speak, to claim this happiness publicly. James clinked his glass gently, and the room gradually quieted. He looked at me with such open adoration that for a moment, I forgot about everyone else. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady and sure. "But mostly, I want to thank Sophia for saying yes." The crowd chuckled appreciatively. I'm not from a world where people make fancy speeches, but I am from a world where people say what they mean. So here it is. Sophia, you are the kindest, strongest, most authentic person I've ever known. And every day I watch you choose to be yourself, despite a lifetime of being told that wasn't enough. I felt tears threatening. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother shift uncomfortably. "To me, you've always been more than enough," James continued. "You're everything, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that again." The room erupted in applause. James handed me the microphone with an encouraging smile, and I took a deep breath. "I spent most of my life trying to be perfect," I began, my voice shakier than I'd hoped. "Perfect daughter, perfect student, perfect reflection of what others needed me to be." Then I met James, who looked at me and said, "What do you want?" And I realized no one had ever asked me that before. There was a rustle of movement from my mother's table. I pressed on. "James taught me that love isn't something you earn through achievement or social standing. It's something freely given, with no expectations attached." I raised my glass. "To finding the courage to be loved exactly as we are." I had just finished speaking when my mother stood up. There was something in her posture that sent warning signals through my body, a rigidity I recognized from childhood confrontations. She walked toward me with practiced poise, her heels clicking deliberately against the stone terrace. "May I?" she said, not really asking as she took the microphone from my hand. Her smile was fixed in place, the one she used for difficult donors and uncooperative committee members. "I'd like to say a few words about my daughter," she began, her voice carrying that melodic quality she used for public speaking. "Sophia has always been sensitive, always looking for approval in the wrong places." The room stilled. I felt James tense beside me. When she was young, she would bring home stray animals, broken toys, always trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. Her laugh tinkled like glass breaking. "I see this pattern continuing." She turned to face me directly, but she was performing for the room. "Darling, I know you think this is what you want, just as I once thought I wanted something similar. But you're making the same mistake I did, marrying beneath your potential because it feels like rebellion." The words hit like physical blows. James's hand found mine, squeezing tightly, but I couldn't look at him, couldn't look at anyone. The room had gone completely silent. "You're a Clark," my mother continued, her voice hardening. "And Clarks don't throw away generations of careful social cultivation because they're afraid of their own ambition." "You're not in love with James. You're in love with the idea of disappointing me," someone gasped. I heard the sharp intake of breath from James's mother. My father stared fixedly at his shoes, as he had during every uncomfortable moment of my childhood. "She's making the same mistake I did," my mother repeated, her voice catching slightly. "Marrying beneath her potential." The microphone amplified everything, her words, her controlled breathing, and finally, the sound of ice clinking in a glass as someone at the back of the room stood up. The aftermath freeze. Time seemed to stop. My mother's words hung in the air, poisonous and impossible to unhear. I felt a curious detachment settle over me, as if I were floating above the scene, watching someone else's life implode in high definition. I couldn't look at James, couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes, the confirmation that my family would never truly accept him. My throat closed around words I couldn't formulate. Apologies, denials, defenses, all inadequate against the precision strike my mother had just delivered. The room had transformed into a tableau of frozen reactions. James's parents sat rigid with shock, his mother's hand pressed against her mouth. My father studied his champagne glass with the intense focus he usually reserved for difficult contract negotiations, a coward's retreat I'd witnessed countless times before. The Henderson family, containing my mother's preferred match, exchanged meaningful glances from their table near the front. I became acutely aware of sensory details, the faint scent of roses growing cloying in the summer heat, the distant sound of traffic beyond the hotel grounds, the uncomfortable tightness of my carefully selected shoes, anything to avoid the reality of what had just happened. James moved first. He reached for the microphone, his hand steady despite everything. My mother relinquished it with a smile that suggested she'd done us both a favor by speaking her truth. "I think we could all use a moment," James said, his voice controlled in a way that broke my heart. This was his nurse voice, the one he used when delivering difficult news to parents, when creating calm in crisis. He shouldn't have to use that voice here, tonight, at what should have been our celebration. A murmur moved through the crowd as people sought to fill the awful silence. Someone turned up the music slightly. Small groups formed as guests pretended to resume conversations, though every eye kept darting back to our unfolding family drama. James turned to me, his back to the room, creating a small pocket of privacy amid the spectacle. "Sophia," he said softly, "look at me." I couldn't. If I looked at him, the careful numbness protecting me would shatter. "We can leave right now," he continued. "Just say the word." My mother stood a few feet away, already engaged in damage control, her hand on the arm of my father's business partner, her voice low and confiding, explaining me away, as she'd done my entire life when I failed to meet her standards. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, still not meeting James's eyes. "I should have known she would." "Stop," he interrupted gently. You are not responsible for her cruelty. Not now, not ever. Across the room, I saw my father finally stand, moving toward us with reluctant obligation in every step. Too little, too late. The story of our relationship. Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately, my father suggested when he reached us, his voice barely audible over the music. Always the mediator, always seeking to minimize public discomfort rather than address the actual harm. "There's nothing to discuss, William," my mother called, having somehow heard him despite the distance. "I've simply stated what everyone in this room already knows." That's when I finally looked up and saw the faces of our guests. Not universal disapproval as I'd feared, but a complex mix of emotions, embarrassment, discomfort, and on many faces, particularly among my oldest friends, something that looked like sad recognition. They'd witnessed versions of this throughout my life. My mother's subtle undermining, her backhanded compliments, her impossible standards. This was just the most public manifestation of a dynamic they'd always seen. And in that moment of clarity, as I prepared to gather whatever dignity remained and leave with James, a movement from the back corner of the terrace caught everyone's attention. My grandmother Rose, my father's mother, who had sat silently throughout the evening in her designated place of honor, slowly pushed herself to her feet. At 82, Rose Clark rarely spoke at family gatherings anymore, content to observe, to accept the obligatory greetings, to be the family matriarch in name while ceding all actual authority to my mother. I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard her voice raised in disagreement, but something in her face now, a hardness, a resolution, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My mother noticed it too. For the first time that evening, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her perfect features. The unexpected defender. My grandmother moved with deliberate slowness, the kind that commands attention rather than loses it. Her cane tapped against the stone terrace, creating a rhythm that somehow cut through the uncomfortable murmuring of the crowd. She wore midnight blue, her concession to formal occasions, and the diamond brooch my grandfather had given her on their 50th anniversary. No one moved to help her, not because they lacked concern, but because something in her bearing warned against it. This was Rose Clark as I'd never seen her, and as I would later learn, as my mother had seen her only once before. She made her way to the center of the room where we stood, our fractured family tableau on display for all to witness. When she reached us, she extended her hand, not to me or my father, but directly to James. "The microphone, if you would be so kind," she said, her voice stronger than I remembered. James handed it to her without hesitation. My grandmother had always been kind to him, one of the few in my family who seemed genuinely interested in his work, his background, his thoughts, but they had never spoken at length, my mother having mastered the art of keeping them separated at family gatherings. "Margaret," my grandmother said, addressing my mother by her full name rather than the Maggie she preferred socially. "You've controlled this family with your bitterness for far too long." The room went impossibly quieter. My mother's face registered shock before quickly reassembling into polite concern. "Mother Clark," she began, employing the formal address she'd always used, part respect, part distance. "You're upset. Perhaps we should—" "I am not upset," my grandmother interrupted, her voice cutting through my mother's attempt at control. "I am, for the first time in 27 years, speaking the truth in this family, and you will listen." She turned slightly, addressing the room at large but keeping my mother fixed in her gaze. "Many of you have known our family for years. You've attended our events, donated to our charities, watched Sophia grow up under Margaret's guidance." The pause was slight but significant. "What you don't know, what Margaret has made certain you don't know, is that she stands here tonight, condemning her daughter for the very choice she herself was forbidden to make." My mother went perfectly still. "Rose, that's enough." "No, Margaret, it is not nearly enough." My grandmother's hand tightened on her cane. "You speak of family legacy and social standing as if they were gifts you've bestowed, rather than chains you've forged." She looked at me then, her eyes softening. "Sophia doesn't know, does she? You never told her about Thomas." The name hung in the air. Thomas. I'd never heard it before. And yet something about the way my grandmother said it, and the way my mother flinched at the sound, told me it carried immense weight. "Who is Thomas?" I asked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. My mother stepped forward, her composure cracking visibly now. "Mother Clark, this is neither the time nor the place." "It is precisely the time," my grandmother countered, "because you've made it so with your cruelty tonight." She turned to me again. "Thomas Mercer was a teacher at your mother's university. Brilliant, compassionate, from a family of educators with no social connections worth mentioning. Your mother was 20, and she loved him with the kind of certainty that comes only once in a lifetime." I looked at my mother, trying to reconcile this information with the woman I knew, the woman who measured relationships by their social utility, who had never spoken of love as anything but a practical arrangement between suitable families. "My late husband, your grandfather, discovered their plan to marry after graduation," my grandmother continued. "And he did what powerful men of his generation did. He made certain Thomas understood that his career, his reputation, his future depended on ending the relationship." My father shifted uncomfortably beside me. This was clearly not news to him. "Your mother was given a choice," my grandmother said, her voice heavy with old regret. "Marry William Clark, secure the merger between our family's businesses that had been planned since her childhood, or be cut off completely, financially, socially, familiarly." I stared at my mother, seeing her truly for perhaps the first time. Behind the perfect makeup, the rigidly controlled expression, I caught a glimpse of something raw and wounded. "She chose security," my grandmother said simply, "as women in our circle have been taught to do for generations. She chose the match that had been arranged for her. She did exactly what was expected." My grandmother moved closer to my mother now, her voice softening but still amplified by the microphone. "And you have spent 27 years punishing yourself for that choice by ensuring your daughter would have no choice at all. You've tried to shape Sophia into a perfect reflection of the path you took, because anything else would force you to confront what you gave up. You have no right," my mother whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "I have every right," my grandmother replied. "I stood by and watched my husband destroy your chance at happiness. I said nothing when you did the same to your daughter year after year. But I will not stand silent tonight while you publicly humiliate this child for having the courage you were never permitted to have." She turned to the crowd, her spine straight despite her years. "Margaret wasn't allowed to marry for love, but that is no excuse for trying to deny Sophia the same choice." My mother's composure finally broke. "He would have ruined her life," she said, no longer caring who heard, "just as Thomas would have ruined mine. A nurse? With student loans and a family that shops at department stores? This isn't a fairy tale, Mother Clark. This is reality." "No," my grandmother said quietly. "This is fear, and it stops tonight." The family secret unravels. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, changing the very atmosphere of the room. I struggled to process what I'd just heard. This alternate version of my mother as a young woman in love, forced to abandon her heart's choice for family obligation. It seemed impossible to reconcile with the Margaret Clark I knew, who wielded social connections like weapons and measured worth in pedigrees and bank accounts. "Is it true?" I asked my mother directly, finding my voice at last. "Was there someone before Dad? Someone you actually loved?" My mother's face had gone blank in that particular way I recognized from childhood crises. A complete shutdown of visible emotion, her ultimate defense mechanism. "Your grandmother is romanticizing ancient history," she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Choices were made that were best for everyone involved." "Best for whom?" I pressed, suddenly desperate to understand. "For you? For grandfather's business merger?" My father cleared his throat, finally finding the courage to enter the conversation. "Sophia, perhaps we should continue this privately." "No," I interrupted, surprising myself with my firmness. "I've spent my entire life navigating carefully around Mother's disapproval, never understanding why nothing I did was ever enough. I deserve to hear the truth. Now. All of it." My grandmother nodded slightly, a gesture of approval I hadn't realized I'd been seeking. "Tell her, Margaret," she said. "Tell her what happened to Thomas after you married William." Something flashed across my mother's face. Genuine pain, quickly masked. "He left the university," she said flatly. "Moved across the country. Married eventually. Had children." "And?" my grandmother prompted. My mother's hands trembled slightly. "And he's been teaching at Berkeley for the past 20 years. Environmental ethics. He's respected in his field." The way she said "respected," with a slight catch in her voice, told me volumes about what that word truly meant to my mother. "You've kept track of him," I realized aloud. "All this time." She didn't deny it. "Your mother receives the Berkeley Academic Journal," my grandmother explained. "Has done so for 2 decades. I've seen her reading his articles, cutting them out when she thinks no one is watching." My father looked away, confirmation in his avoidance. He'd known. Of course he had. "He was nominated for a Pulitzer last year," my mother said quietly, almost to herself, "for his book on environmental justice." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. My mother's obsession with status and appearance, her constant pushing for me to consider law school, business school, careers with prestige attached, her insistence that I date men from suitable families, her thinly veiled disappointment when I chose to work for nonprofits rather than join the family business. "You've been trying to justify your choice," I said slowly. "All these years? If I succeeded in all the ways you defined success, it would prove you made the right decision. You know nothing about the choices I've had to make," my mother snapped, but there was something brittle in her tone now. "Nothing about what it means to consider your future beyond momentary feelings." "You're right," I agreed, surprising her. "I don't know, because you never told me. You never shared anything real with me, just expectations and criticisms." From the corner of my eye, I saw James's parents exchange a look of pained understanding. They had assumed, as had everyone, that my mother's coldness was simply her nature, not a carefully constructed defense against her own regrets. "Did you ever love Dad?" The question escaped before I could consider its implications. My father's face remained carefully neutral, suggesting this was not the first time the question had arisen. "I made a commitment," my mother answered, not quite addressing the question. "I honored it. That's what adults do, Sophia. They make difficult choices and they live with them. They don't have to punish their children for those choices," my grandmother interjected gently. My mother turned on her then. "And where was this righteous defense when it might have actually mattered? You watched your husband destroy my future and said nothing. 27 years of judgmental silence, and now you decide to speak? You're right," my grandmother acknowledged, surprising everyone. "I failed you, Margaret. My generation of women was taught to stand by our husbands' decisions, to prioritize family stability above individual happiness. I regret my silence every day." She turned to me. "But Sophia deserves better than to inherit our mistakes. This cycle of unhappiness ends here." My mother laughed bitterly. "With what? A nurse who will never provide the life she was raised to expect? Who will make her choose between his career and children? Whose family holiday gatherings involve folding tables in the backyard rather than properly catered events?" "With love," James said quietly, speaking for the first time since my grandmother had taken the microphone. "With honesty, with the freedom to define success on her own terms." "Naive," my mother dismissed. "Happy," James countered. "Something you've never allowed Sophia to be." An uncomfortable silence fell as the truth of his words registered. I thought of birthdays spent worrying if my party would meet my mother's standards. Academic achievements celebrated only as stepping stones to the next expected accomplishment. My entire life spent seeking an approval that was structurally designed to be withheld. She's been preparing me to make the same choice she did, I realized aloud. To choose security over love, status over happiness. "I've been trying to protect you," my mother insisted, but her certainty was wavering. "From what?" I asked. "From a life with someone who values me for who I am rather than what family I come from? From the terrible fate of being loved unconditionally? From regret," she answered, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "From waking up 20 years from now and wondering what might have been." And there it was, the truth at last. My mother's crusade had never been about my future at all. It had been about her past, about the road not taken, the life unlived, the love abandoned in the name of family obligation. So instead, you guaranteed I'd spend my life regretting not being allowed to make my own choices, I said, the realization both painful and liberating. This was never about me at all. The turning point. The party had become something else entirely, a public excavation of decades of family dysfunction. Guests stood frozen in uncomfortable witness, unable to leave without acknowledging their intrusion, unwilling to miss the unfolding drama. In any other circumstance, I would have been mortified by the spectacle we'd become, but something had shifted inside me. Some fundamental understanding of my life and my mother's influence over it. James moved to my side, his presence solid and reassuring. He didn't touch me, sensing perhaps that I needed to stand entirely on my own in this moment. But he was there, a choice I had made that my mother couldn't unmake with her disapproval. "Sophia," he said softly, for my ears alone despite the crowd, "we can end this now. Walk away. None of this has to define us or our future." I looked at him then, really looked at this man who had seen something in me worth loving despite the careful walls I'd built, the constant self-editing, the desperate need for approval I'd never acknowledged. "What do you see when you look at me?" I asked him, needing suddenly to understand. His answer came without hesitation. "Someone brave. Someone who keeps trying to connect, despite having every reason not to trust. Someone who laughs with her whole body when she forgets to be careful. Someone who apologizes too much and deserves to apologize less." He smiled slightly. "Someone who pretends to like classical music because her mother expects it, but has a secret playlist of 90s boy bands." A startled laugh escaped me. I'd never told him about that playlist. "I found it on your phone," he admitted. "When you asked me to put on music that night, you were sick. I've never mentioned it because I figured there was a reason you kept it secret." Such a small thing, a musical preference hidden away like contraband, but it crystallized everything about how I'd learned to exist in my mother's orbit, constantly concealing parts of myself that didn't fit her vision of who I should be. "I want a life where I don't have to hide stupid playlists," I said, the words feeling like a declaration of independence. "I want a life where I can be fully myself, even the parts that are messy or ordinary or unsophisticated." James nodded. "That's the only kind of life worth living." I turned back to my mother, who stood rigidly beside my grandmother, looking somehow diminished despite her perfect posture, her expensive dress, her carefully maintained facade. "I'm sorry," I said, surprising myself with the words. My mother's expression flickered with confusion. "I'm sorry that you weren't allowed to choose your own path," I continued. "I'm sorry that your parents valued business connections over your happiness. I'm sorry that you've spent decades wondering what might have been if you'd been brave enough to defy them." She flinched as if I'd struck her. "You have no idea." "You're right," I interrupted gently. "I don't know what that pain has been like for you, but I do know what it's been like to be your daughter. To be the repository for all your regrets and disappointments. To never quite measure up because I could never validate a choice you've spent your life questioning." My father moved toward my mother, perhaps sensing she needed support, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Always in control, even in crisis. Everything I've done has been to ensure you had opportunities," she said, but the conviction in her voice was waning. "Security, connections, a place in society that can't be taken from you. I never wanted those things," I replied. "I wanted you to be proud of me, to love me as I am, not as some projection of who you think I should be." "Of course I love you," she said, sounding almost offended. "Everything I've done has been because I love you." "No," I said, the realization solidifying as I spoke. "Everything you've done has been because you fear for me. There's a difference. Love trusts. Fear controls." My grandmother nodded slightly, her eyes filled with a complicated mixture of sorrow and pride. "I will not inherit your regrets," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I will not spend my life second-guessing my own heart because you weren't allowed to follow yours. I will not punish my future children for choices I was afraid to make." The words hung between us, irrevocable. My mother's face went through a series of micro-expressions: anger, hurt, denial, before settling into something I'd rarely seen: uncertainty. "You think it's so simple," she said finally, "that you can just choose love and everything else falls into place. Life isn't a romance novel, Sophia." "No," I agreed. "It's much more complicated, and much shorter than we pretend it is. Too short to live it for someone else's validation." I glanced at James, drawing strength from his quiet confidence in me. Then I looked around the room at the gathered witnesses to our family's unraveling. Friends who had seen me shrink myself to fit my mother's expectations, James's family with their open affection and noisy authenticity, business associates who had only ever known the carefully curated version of the Clark family. "I'm not rejecting you, Mother," I said, softening my tone. "I'm rejecting the idea that I have to earn your love by becoming a version of myself that makes you comfortable. I'm rejecting the idea that my worth is measured by the social connections my marriage can secure." I took a deep breath, feeling decades of tension begin to loosen their grip on my chest. I choose James. I choose a life defined by love rather than fear. I choose to break this cycle. My mother stood very still, absorbing my words. For a moment, just a brief flicker, I thought I saw something like recognition in her eyes, perhaps even a grudging respect. Then she straightened, smoothed her dress with practiced hands, and turned to my father. "We're leaving," she announced, her voice betraying nothing of the emotional earthquake we'd just experienced. My father hesitated, looking between us with the conflicted expression of a man who had spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation. "William," my mother prompted sharply. "Actually," my father said, surprising everyone, "I think I'll stay a bit longer." He glanced at me with something almost like apology. "If that's all right." It was the smallest act of defiance, but from my father, it felt seismic. My mother registered the rebellion with a slight widening of her eyes, then turned and walked toward the exit with measured steps, her back impossibly straight, refusing the audience the satisfaction of seeing her retreat. As she reached the edge of the terrace, she paused, not turning around. "He writes to me," she said, her voice carrying despite its softness. "Thomas, once a year, on what would have been our anniversary." I never respond. And then she was gone, leaving us with this final, devastating revelation: resolution and transformation. My mother's departure left a vacuum in the room, as if she had taken all the oxygen with her. For a moment, no one seemed to know what to do. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. Waitstaff hovered with trays of untouched champagne. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. My grandmother broke the silence, handing the microphone back to James with a decisive nod. "I believe," she said clearly, "that we still have an engagement to celebrate." Her words released some of the tension. Conversations gradually resumed, though now with the hushed intensity of people processing a shared dramatic experience. My father stood awkwardly nearby, looking both lost and strangely liberated, like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden he'd carried for decades. "Dad," I said, approaching him cautiously, "did you know about Thomas?" He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Yes. Not at first, but yes. Your mother received a letter about 10 years into our marriage. I found it. And you stayed." He finally looked at me. "Marriage is complicated, Sophia. Your mother and I, we built a life. It wasn't what either of us imagined, perhaps, but it became something solid." "Solid," I repeated. "Not passionate, not joyful. Solid. Don't judge her too harshly," he said quietly. "She loved you the only way she knew how, by trying to make me as unhappy as she was." The words came out sharper than I intended. My father winced. "By trying to protect you from what she saw as naive choices. Right or wrong, she believed she was doing what was best for you." James approached, tentative, allowing us space for this family reckoning, but making it clear he was there if I needed him. "I'm sorry for," my father gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire disastrous evening, "for not standing up to her. Not just tonight. Always." The apology, inadequate as it was, felt significant coming from a man who had spent his life avoiding confrontation. I wasn't ready to absolve him completely, but I recognized the effort it took him to acknowledge his failure. "I'd like to get to know James better," he added, surprising me. "Perhaps you could both come to dinner next week. Just the three of us." Before I could respond, James's mother Elena appeared at my side, wrapping me in the kind of embrace my own mother had always considered too demonstrative for public settings. "Family is what we make it, Kirita," she whispered, her accent thickening with emotion. "And you are already part of ours, no matter what." The simple acceptance in her words brought tears to my eyes, tears I'd been holding back throughout the confrontation with my mother. James's father joined us, his hand warm on my shoulder, forming a protective circle that felt like everything family should be. Across the terrace, my grandmother was speaking with James's grandmother, two matriarchs from entirely different worlds finding common ground in their concern for their grandchildren. It struck me then that this was the real merger taking place tonight, not between social classes or family businesses, but between people who chose to see and value each other. "What happens now?" I asked James, suddenly overwhelmed by the public nature of our family implosion. He smiled, that same smile that had first drawn me to him in the service corridor of the hospital charity event. "Now we figure it out together, one day at a time." The party gradually transformed into something more authentic than the carefully orchestrated social event my mother had planned. James's cousins convinced the quartet to play something more contemporary. My childhood friend Eliza, who had witnessed years of my mother's subtle undermining, hugged me fiercely and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." My father, after an awkward conversation with James's parents, actually laughed at something James's uncle said, a genuine laugh I rarely heard in social settings. My grandmother held court from her corner table, finally telling stories about her own youth that had always been deemed inappropriate by my mother. As the evening wound down, unexpected allies emerged from the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, mother of my mother's preferred match for me, squeezed my hand and said, "Margaret and I were roommates in college. I knew Thomas. He was a good man. Your mother was never the same after she gave him up." Mr. Crawley, my father's oldest business associate, clapped James on the shoulder and declared, "About time someone shook up the Clark dynasty. Too much inbreeding among the social set these days." Even Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister who had always emulated her perfect composure, cornered me by the dessert table. "I almost did it too," she confessed after too much champagne. "Ran away with a jazz musician from New Orleans." Sometimes I still wonder. The revelations kept coming, as if my grandmother's truth-telling had given everyone permission to acknowledge the complex realities beneath carefully maintained social veneers. These people, these proper, polished members of my mother's world, all had their own stories of compromise, rebellion, regret. They had just learned to bury them more successfully than my mother had. As the crowd thinned, James found me on the terrace overlooking the hotel gardens. "You okay?" he asked, his hand finding mine in the darkness. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I feel everything, all at once. Angry, sad, relieved, free." He nodded, understanding as always. "Your grandmother wants to talk to you before she leaves. She's inside with my mom, comparing recipes and plotting our entire married life, I think." I laughed, despite everything. "That's terrifying." "Actually," he said, "I think it's kind of wonderful. Your grandmother is pretty amazing when she's not being silenced by your mother." Inside, I found my grandmother holding court with James's family, looking more animated than I'd seen her in years. When she saw me, she extended her hand, drawing me close. "I should have said something sooner," she said quietly. "Years sooner." "Why tonight?" I asked. "After all this time, why speak up now?" She looked at me steadily. "Because I saw myself in you tonight, standing at a crossroads between what others expect and what your heart knows is right. I couldn't fail another generation of women in this family." I hugged her then, breathing in her familiar scent of lavender and face powder, feeling the fragility of her shoulders beneath my arms. "Your mother will come around," she said as we parted. "Not immediately. Margaret has always required time to process defeat. There was a hint of dry humor in her tone. But she will. She loves you, Sophia, in her complicated way. I'm not sure I'm ready to forgive her, I admitted. Forgiveness isn't an event, dear. It's a process. One that may take years. She patted my hand. But remember this. Margaret is as much a victim of our family's values as she is their perpetrator. Understanding that may help when you're ready. The party continued to wind down around us, transforming from the formal event my mother had orchestrated into something messier but more genuine. Just like my life was about to become, I realized. Messier, less predictable, but infinitely more authentic. 1 week after the engagement party, James and I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of our new apartment, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and the mismatched furniture we'd collected from friends and family. The space was nothing like the pristine Clark family home. Our coffee table was an old trunk James had rescued from a thrift store. Our dishes didn't match, and the walls desperately needed painting. I loved every imperfect inch of it. "Your dad called again," James said, pulling takeout containers from a paper bag. "He wants to know if Saturday still works for dinner." I nodded, surprised by how quickly my father had followed through on his promise to get to know James better. He'd called 3 times in the past week, each conversation slightly less awkward than the last. Small steps toward a relationship that had never been allowed to develop under my mother's watchful eye. "And your grandmother sent this," James added, sliding a small package across the makeshift coffee table. "It arrived this morning." I opened it to find a beautiful leather-bound journal with a note in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. "For recording the life you choose, not the one chosen for you. All my love, Grandma Rose." The simple gift brought unexpected tears to my eyes. My grandmother had started calling more often, too, sharing family stories I'd never heard, filling in gaps in my understanding of our complicated history. She was making up for decades of silence, and I was grateful for her effort, even as I recognized it couldn't erase the past. "Any word from your mother?" James asked carefully. "No," I said, trying to ignore the twinge of hurt. Despite everything, some childish part of me had expected, hoped, she would reach out, attempt to repair what had broken between us. "Dad says she's processing." James nodded, not offering platitudes or false reassurances. It was one of the things I loved most about him, his willingness to sit with difficult truths rather than try to smooth them over. We were just finishing dinner when the doorbell rang. James raised an eyebrow. We weren't expecting anyone, and few people had our new address yet. I opened the door to find my mother standing in the hallway, looking almost unrecognizable in simple slacks and a blouse, her hair pulled back without its usual perfect styling. She held a small gift bag in one hand. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. I stepped back wordlessly, too shocked to formulate a response. James appeared behind me, equally surprised but recovering more quickly. "Ms. Clark," he said, polite but reserved. "Would you like some tea?" My mother nodded, her eyes taking in our modest apartment with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not judgment exactly, but something more complex, a mixture of concern and curiosity. "It's small," I said defensively as she followed me to our secondhand couch. "It's yours," she replied simply. "That counts for something." We sat in awkward silence until James returned with mugs of tea, then excused himself tactfully. "I'll be in the bedroom, unpacking books," he said, giving me a reassuring smile. When he was gone, my mother placed the gift bag on the coffee table between us. "This was my grandmother's," she said. "My father's mother. It was meant to be given to me on my wedding day, but after what happened with Thomas, my father decided I wasn't worthy of it." Curious despite myself, I opened the bag and drew out a small velvet box. Inside was an antique sapphire ring, delicate and undeniably beautiful. "I've kept it in my jewelry box for 27 years, my mother continued. "I was saving it for your wedding, for when you made the right choice." She paused, struggling visibly with her next words. I was wrong about what that means. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "I don't expect forgiveness, Sophia," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "What I did at your engagement party was unforgivable, but I want you to know that I'm trying to understand. to see beyond my own fear and regret. "Why now?" I asked, echoing the question I'd asked my grandmother a week ago. After a lifetime of criticism and control, why this sudden change? My mother looked down at her hands, perfectly manicured as always, but somehow more vulnerable without her usual rings and bracelets. "Your grandmother told me something after the party," she said quietly. "She said Thomas asked about me in his last letter, wanted to know if I was happy." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and I realized I couldn't honestly say yes. Not because I made the wrong choice 27 years ago, but because I've spent every day since then punishing myself and you for a path not taken. It wasn't a complete transformation. My mother would never be the warm, demonstrative parent I'd sometimes longed for, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the damage she'd caused in her attempt to protect me from her own regrets. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "How to be a mother who doesn't direct, control. It's the only way I've known. I don't know how to do this either," I replied honestly. "How to be a daughter who doesn't constantly seek your approval, who makes choices you don't understand." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Perhaps we can learn together, if you're willing." I didn't answer immediately, aware that this was a moment of choice as significant as any I'd faced. The easy path would be to maintain my anger, to hold her mistakes against her as she had held her own regrets against herself for decades. The harder, braver choice was to break that cycle, to attempt understanding without guaranteeing forgiveness. "It won't be quick," I said finally. "Or easy." "No," she agreed. "But it might be worth it." She gestured to the ring box still in my hand. "That belongs to you now regardless. No conditions attached." As she stood to leave, I saw my mother clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the intimidating figure of my childhood, nor as the villain of the engagement party, but as a complex woman shaped by her own choices and the choices made for her. A woman who had loved and lost and built a life anyway, who had failed me in fundamental ways but was, at last, attempting to face that failure. "Mom," I said as she reached the door, "would you like to come to dinner next Saturday? Dad's coming, and James's parents." She turned, surprise and something like hope flickering across her face. "I'd like that," she said softly. After she left, James emerged from the bedroom, approaching cautiously. "Everything okay?" I looked at the sapphire ring, then at our imperfect apartment with its mismatched furniture and waiting possibilities, and finally at James, the choice I'd made for myself. "No," I answered truthfully. "But I think someday it might be. Sometimes it takes a public breaking to begin a private healing. Our family would never be perfect, would never resemble the polished image my mother had maintained for decades. But perhaps we could become something real instead, something honest, something built on truth rather than fear. And that, I was beginning to understand, was the foundation worth building upon."